right, welcome out. We're heading down the home stretch. We're going to be looking at the four entities, the major meat and potatoes, the House, the Senate, the executive, the judiciary, and then we'll wrap up with some concluding essays, and that'll be it. So let's take a look. Today we're going to let's look at the House and the Senate. As you can see over here, we've got a few, well, nine essays on the House, which is a good amount. We've got 5 on the Senate, and then we've got several on the executive. Quite a bit on the executive, and that's not unexpected because of the fact that, remember, we talked about the Articles of Confederation were rather weak as regards the federal, or the ability of the federal, led by the executive, of course, to collect on taxes, wage war, commerce, and do the necessary staples of what a country needs, right? What does a country need? So again, we're going just through the summary notes. Again, just to reiterate, this is not a thorough look at the Federalist Papers by any stretch of the imagination, nor is it an expert view by any stretch of the imagination, but I've been through these on numerous occasions, so I have a good familiarity with the Federalist Papers and the issues and the Constitution and the 3 branches of government. Okay, so let's just cut to the chase and get right into it. Chapter 52. What should be the qualifications of electors and the elected? How appropriate is that, right? What's happening Tuesday, right? We're going to have an election. The new Constitution laid it down that a representative in the House had to be 25 years old. We went over that. Remember, president is 35, has to be 35, or a senator, 35, right? United States citizen for 7 years, and a resident of the state he was representing, right? So United States citizen for 7 years. So for the House and the Senate, you don't have to be born here. To be president, you have to be a naturalized, or I shouldn't say that, because naturalized implies earning your citizenship. You have to be born here, a natural citizen, right? Not a naturalized. I know they use those words. They're very close in meaning. But anyways, you have to be born here. Let's just say that, right? To be president. He would hold office for 2 years. Going back to colonial days, the states had fixed varying periods of election from 1 to 7 years. It had seemed best to make the period uniform. An election for the House every 2 years, right? Chapter 53, some critics contended that elections to the House should be held annually, quoting the adage that where annual elections end, tyranny begins. Right. Publius disputed this. A 1-year term of office was too short. A House member would scarcely have time to learn his duties, true, before he would be faced with the expense and time of standing up for election again. Under such a circumstance, no representative could be expected to learn much about national affairs, either in the domestic or foreign field. So, one of the advantages, of course, to term limits and not allowing one who is elected to just roost in office indefinitely is the fact that you can vote in those, or vote out, I should say, or not vote for those who are not doing a good job. You can impeach, so the parts are mobile. They're not stuck in office. I know the judiciary, once you're put into the Supreme Court, you're there for life. I'm not a big fan of that, but I understand to a degree why that's done. But anyways, we'll get to that when we get to the judiciary. But and at the same time, but another problem, and this is what I've seen before, is you have people in office for a few years, 2 years of the president for 4 years, and what if things are going really well, and the president serves a term, things go well, and serves a second term, things go well, and then they can't serve a third term. So somebody new has to be elected into office, and you're basically somewhat, depending on the experience of the individual, starting from scratch, right? Learning the executive, or learning the senatorial office, or learning to be a representative in the House, right? So there's all that startup time and that learning time, and also, what if things are going well, and then those people have to, they run out of term time, right? So, and I think this is what Hamilton Madison was referring to when he said, it's good, it's really good, but it also has its problems, the Constitution, right? I mean, it's almost impossible to get out all the little quirks and issues and concerns, right? So you have to deal with it, right? 54 is the number of each state's delegates to the House was to be determined by the size of its population. Were slaves to be included? Here we go. The southern states consider their slaves in some degree as men. And a compromise, so here's your racist issue in regards to the Constitution. And of course, these issues have since passed by, and they are of no longer concern since slavery has been outlawed, right? But I understand initially, but it's something that they had to deal with, right? And we talked about this before, that they couldn't just abolish slavery. That's not something that could just, snap your fingers and it's done away with, right? Of course, in order to get rid of it completely, a war occurred. So if they were waiting for a perfect moment to ratify the Constitution, there was none. The thing was, get the Constitution going, and we'll work on the slavery issue as time passes. But we need the Constitution. We need a strong executive. We need changes now, right? For the protection of the country, for the economy, for elections, and so forth, right? In a compromise, the Constitution stipulated that slaves should be counted as inhabitants, but because of their servitude, each was to be counted as only 3/5 of a man. And that's a problem. So that's, if you've ever wondered why 3/5, and just that alone is derogatory, negative connotations galore in nature, right? So here it says, in a compromise, let's go over this again. The Constitution stipulated that slaves should be counted as inhabitants, but because of their servitude, each was to be counted as only 3/5 of a man. Is that good? I mean, this is not something that many people today would look at and go, "Oh, I'm good with that. I'm all right with that." But you have to consider, and I'm not saying it's good or bad one way or the other. You just have to consider what was going on at the time and where people were coming from. What was the mindset? Where were they in their ability to deal with the slavery issue, right? Again, so as Madison said, the Constitution, good, had its problems, still has its problems, shortcomings. The Electoral College certainly still has its issues, but generally speaking, it works well, mostly works well. In most regards, it works well, does its job, right? Keeps everybody in the game, everybody who's living, doesn't matter where, large state, medium-sized state, small state, your thoughts, your concerns matter. They're attended to, right, by your representatives and by your senators, and even by the executive. It should be, right? And that's why you see when people are running for office, especially at the national level, right? You think of the executive, the president. President can't just go to 2 or 3 or 4 states. I'll just campaign at the 4 largest states, and that's all that matters. Because it's a popular vote. I just have to go there. So the little guy and gal get ignored. That's not good. So the Electoral College addresses that issue, and it does other things, but we'll get to that when we get to that, right? Anyways, 55 was argued against the House of Representatives that in the beginning, at least, it would have too few members to be a safe depository of the public interest that could not be trusted with so much power. Interesting. The states vary greatly in the number of delegates they had in the lower houses of their legislative assemblies. Under the proposed constitution, the number of seats in the House of Representatives at the beginning would be 65. But as census was to be taken within 3 years, and it might raise the number of representatives to 100. It was estimated that with population growth, the number would be 200 in 25 years, 450, which would put an end to all fears about the small size of the body. And of course, now we've got 330 million. So at some point that, that ratio, the idea that you'll just keep adding representatives to the House as the population grows, you're just going to have way too many representatives. There's 435 now, right? So they're talking 400 in 50 years, 500 in 75 years, 600, and I don't know what, right? So at some point you had to kind of like figure it out. And of course, the necessary correct choice was made. Chapter 56, it was also charged that the House of Representatives would be too small to have adequate knowledge of the interest of its constituents. Representatives should know the needs of their constituents and be responsive to them, of course, but they should have time in office to acquire some perspective on such national problems as regulation of foreign and interstate commerce, taxation, defense, so forth. A House representing every 30,000 inhabitants in the country would be both a safe and competent guardian of the interests confided to it. So there you go. So now you can see why, yeah. And if you got rid of the, I guess getting rid of the Electoral College, you would get rid. Why would you need representatives, right? You get rid of all the representatives because after a while you get rid of the Electoral College and just go by popular vote, where the majority of those who vote are, right? And as I said, the 4 largest states, California, Texas, New York, and Florida, 3 are of one party and the 4th one is of the other party. So you can see the problem, right? The majority of those in the popular vote are in one party. So, pretty consistently, it's just going to be one party getting elected, term after term after term. So that's kind of crazy, right? Plus, if you get rid of the Electoral College, why would you need representatives or senators? Since the voices of the those in the individual states have been completely ignored. They're not being represented anymore. So just have, I don't know, no senators and no representatives. We'll just have an executive who will run everything by himself or herself. Or then you go, what does that sound like, right? So you go back to a monarch, you go back to a dictator, right? So you can see this is the thing, and people don't think these things through, right? Chapter 57, another charge against the House of Representatives was that it would be composed of those with least sympathy for the mass of the people and most likely to aim at an ambitious sacrifice of the many to the aggrandizement of the few. This would depend on who was entitled to vote for the representatives, right? Yeah, so again, the House, the representatives are more beholden to the people, closer to the people, right? So, yeah, it would be least sympathetic to the general mass or the aggregate, the country at large, right? Who were to be the electors of the federal representatives? They were to be the same as those who elected representatives to the lower legislative chambers in the various states. The electors would be the great body of the American people, not the rich more than the poor, nor the learned more than the ignorant, not the haughty heirs of distinguished names, more than the humble sons of obscure and unpropitious. I'll be all right. More than the humble sons of obscure and unpropitious fortune. Such electors could be trusted to choose fitting public spirited persons to represent them and their various interests in the House of Representatives. Right. So the electors, that's kind of a weird. It took me a while to understand what that's all about, right? So each state has a number of electors, right? Let me get a map. Hold on. All right, so here it is. You see here, so this is what's going to happen on Tuesday. You need 270 to win, right? So if we look around, you basically go to the corners, the four corners of the globe. No, the four corners of the country, right? More or less. You got California with 54. And I said this before, right? I had a little bit out of order. I said California, Texas, New York, Florida. It's actually California, Texas, Florida, New York. So I'll go by the size. Florida, though, is red. Now, is that true? I think that is one of the states that kind of is in flux. California, 54, Texas, 40, Florida, 30, and New York, 28. So say, for instance, let's just for argument's sake, say that California, Florida, New York are all blue, right? You got 60, 110. So that's close, 110, 120 roughly, right? Electoral votes in just 3 states, right? And so if you're just going, the popular vote, right? And generally, blue votes blue, red votes red. You do have independent voters for sure, but they're relatively consistent as well. Oddly enough, if you look at the numbers, look at the poll data, the research data, right? So, anyways, so say you're 120, right? You just in those 3 states, 120. So you've got 150 to go, right? 120 plus 150, 270, right? So in just 3 states, 120. You just have 150 electoral votes to go. So popular vote would cause all kinds of problems. And now look at all of the states, especially the red states, poor red states. Montana 4, Indiana 4, Wyoming 3, North, South Dakota 3, 3, 4, 6. I'm just going down 7. Utah, Nevada, Arizona 6, 6, 11. Missouri 10. So look at them, and all through the South. I'm just looking at the electoral numbers: 6, 8, 6, 9, 16, 9, 16, 11, 8, 11. I'm going through the red state, 17, 4, right? So a lot of those states, very, very, very small numbers. So you can see, though, if you didn't have the Electoral College and the need for all 270 votes and doing it through the Electoral College, not doing it through a popular vote, and occasionally a politician has won the electoral votes. I'm sorry, the popular vote, I'll be okay, but not the electoral, right? And some say that's problematic. That's a little glitch in the system, but it hasn't happened that many times. Maybe 3 times, 4 times at the most, right? Doesn't happen that often. And if it happens in your favor, no problem. But if it happens in opposition to what you want, then everybody's up in arms. You know, if it affects in the negative, of course, everybody's up in arms, right? So that's kind of what's going to happen Tuesday, right? So you need 270 to win, which is the majority. Okay. And if you look, you look at the top there, 268 Republicans, 270 Democrats, right? That's the total number. So, you know, slightly above the midpoint, 270, right? That's the winner. All right. So anyways, so when I talk about the Electoral College, maybe you want to pop out Electoral College map for yourself as this is being discussed, or when we get into the Electoral College in a little more detail later on, have that map at the ready. But there you go. Okay, in chapter 58, critics of the Constitution were contending that no assurance was given that the number of members in the House would increase with the growth in population. That's a problem. That was a mistaken view. It was stipulated that within 3 years, in 1790, a population census was to be taken, and a similar census every 10 years thereafter to determine what adjustments should be made in the number of each state's representatives in the House. There would be small chance of organized resistance to such adjustments, for the people would demand change to secure adequate representation. All right. Chapter 29, the new Constitution provided that the time, place, and manner of electing United States senators and representatives should be regulated by the state legislatures, but that the Congress could also alter such regulations, except as to places of choosing senators. The provision has been attacked, but nothing was more evident than the plain proposition that every government ought to contain in itself the means of its own preservation. If the power of regulating elections for the national government were left entirely in the hands of state legislatures, the latter would have the union entirely at their mercy and might take off in various divergences and objections, right? Again, so there's this constant providing of checks and balances, right? This may happen, so therefore that won't happen. We do this. And because we did this, now something else might happen. So now we've instilled some other policy or procedure or methodology to negate that problem, right? But again, it's kind of like, you know, that game whack-a-mole. You know, you're always trying to hit the mole as it comes up. It's very difficult because, you know, once you fix or work to amend one problem, sometimes it creates other issues elsewhere, right? In chapter 60, what would be the danger if the ultimate, in chapter 60, what would be the danger if the ultimate right of regulating its own elections were left to the union itself? There should be no apprehension on that score. That provision could not be used to promote the election of some favorite class or men in election of others. There would be no possibility of domination by the wealthy and the well-born, as critics contended. Agriculture and commerce, the landed interests and the mercantile interests would have weight in national councils proportionate to their strength in the several states, with the bulk of the voters having a predominant voice in each state. Now, we know, for instance, that there is money in politics, and that money, the elites, the wealthy, the millionaires, probably billionaires by now, do control things to a degree. But because of that, you know, if they just go to Washington and ply senators and representatives might be a little hard to buy off, you know, senators and the executive, right? If they just go to Washington and cut deals there, you know, lobbying, that's what lobbyists do, lobbying, right? Well, the power ultimately resides in the states. So if the states need to, they can, as a collective unit, a union, decide on making decisions outside of Washington. Did you realize that, right? To what degree, to what extent, when would it be prudent to do so and not do so? Again, I don't have the political experience or know-how, so I'm not going to venture a guess or talk too much about it. All I know is, the states are a power unto themselves, because again, the number one principle of the Constitution is that the people are sovereign, and the power of the people resides in the states, right? Not in their representatives in Washington, D.C., right? Chapter 61, Hamilton replied to the objection that had been raised that elections were not by law required to be held in the counties where the voters resided. He cited the practices in New York, noting that while the objection had some validity, it was not very important. More important was the provision in the Constitution that there should be uniformity in the times of periodically electing members to the House of Representatives and the United States. Such uniformity would be of great benefit to the public welfare, both as a security against the same spirit in the body and as a cure for a disease of faction. Faction is, breaking apart, factions. No comment is needed on this section, which is simply an exposition or an exposing, conveying of information and justification of the provisions in the proposed Constitution about the House of Representatives, qualifications of members, by whom elected, and 10 years of office, right? Yeah, so this is really kind of just a laying out of the nuts and bolts, right? What does it look like? What are the schematics? Show me the layout, right? That type of thing. Okay, then we've got the Senate, and not a lot there, pretty brief. So we'll have a short day of it today, a short video today. We're all happy about that. I know my wife is. They always have to run into the other rooms when I'm recording. In chapter 62, qualifications for senators were these: they had to be at least 30 years old and to have been citizens of the nation for 9 years. There it is, right? 30 years old. So House 25, senators, I think I said senators 35, that's the president. Senators 30, natives have to be citizens, to be naturalized, right? Citizens of the nation for 9 years. And I think for the House, you have to be a citizen of the nation for 7 years, right? They were to be designated by the elected legislatures of the individual states. Senators would hold office for 6 years, but under a rotation system whereby 1/3 of the body would be up for election every 2 years, right? So how many senators are there? 100, right? So you got 33 and a third. Well, we won't break them up, right? So 33, 33, 34, maybe, right? So every 1/3 of the body will be up for election every 2 years, right? 2 years, 33 of them. Then the next 2 years, 33 of them. Then the next 2 years, 34 of them, right? At any one time, therefore, 2/3 of the Senate would consist of experienced members, which would give stability and continuity to the Senate's deliberations and decisions. I always remember that Obama was a junior senator, so he was relatively new, but he wasn't there too long as a senator. I don't know. Did he move up? Did he get a good job? Did he get? I don't know. I wasn't paying attention. What did he do? Okay, I'm kidding. In the Senate, unlike the House, the states would have equal representation. Each state, no matter how large or how small, would have 2 senators. There you go. Brought about by a compromise, this was a constitutional recognition of the portion of sovereignty remaining in the individual states. This arrangement would impede passage of bad legislature. No law or resolution could be passed without the concurrence, first of a majority of the people, speaking through the House of Representatives, and then of a majority of the states, speaking through the Senate, right? So look at that again. No law or resolution could be passed without the concurrence, first, of a majority of the people, speaking through the House, right? And then of a majority of the states, speaking through the Senate, right? Chapter 63. The stability and wisdom of such a select Senate would do much to gain the United States more respect from foreign nations. Examples from the history of the republics of antiquity supported this view. So it's not unlike the setup of Roman government, right? There was the Senate, right, and you had the king, right? But you did have a democratic Senate, somewhat, right? A little different scenario, but anyways. Chapter 64, the proposed constitution will give the president the power to make treaties by and with the advice and consent of the Senate, provided that 2/3 of the senators present concur. So just as a point of note, for bills, for instance, anytime a bill is proposed, which is to ultimately, the desire is to ultimately make that bill into a law. So that goes into the House. The House passes it, then it goes to the Senate passes it by a 2/3 vote, right? Is it 2/3? And then if the president vetoes it, no, then it has to go back through the House and Senate for a supermajority, which is 3/4, right? And if it passes, it passes. If it doesn't, it doesn't. It doesn't go to the president again, right? So again, there's those checks and balances, right? And the president gets one veto, right? And he's gone, it's bad. So no, there's problems. There's problems. I'm going to send it back through Congress, and you guys are going to have to think about it again. And you're also going to have to get a few more people on board to pass this, right? Because I don't think it's good as is, right? But then, if Congress says it's good, then they go with it, and the president's voice at that point or opinion is overridden, right? And they had a second chance. They looked at it, and the majority, 485 elected Americans, right? 435 plus 50, is that 45? Say, yeah, that's a go, right? Right. So that's another check and balance, right? This provision was a wide one. The method of electing senators and the president would ensure that direction of foreign affairs would be exercised by men and women, most distinguished by their abilities and virtue, and in whom the people perceive just grounds for confidence. With such men and women, the power of making treaties may be safely lodged. That power cannot be safely entrusted to popular assemblies such as the House of Representatives, subject to drastic changes every 2 years, right? So so there's a little more stability in the upper, I should say, the upper house of the bicameral Congress. Bicameral means two houses or two parts, right? So that's an interesting point, right? That power could not be safe and trusted to popular assemblies such as the House, subject to drastic changes every 2 years, okay? So again, the senators, I don't know if you see them as more serious and sober or whatnot, or even more ethical and moral, but they've certainly had more experience, more know-how, right? A little more seasoned, I guess, to make those decisions, right? To suppose that corruption might influence the president and 2/3 of the Senate in making treaties was an idea too gross and too invidious to be entertained. Okay, do you say so? This is these, by the way, Madison or Hamilton, so I don't know who did what, right? I don't have it here. It's in the details when you go read the individual essays, right? Chapter 65, the proposed constitution gave the Senate the power to participate with the executive in the appointment of major national offices as to act as a court in impeachment trials. There you go, right? So when you see, that's an interesting point. The Senate is asking questions, right? You come before the Senate. The Senate is the part of the House that is asking questions during impeachment of judges or of the executive or whomever, right? And impeachment, if the Senate decides that the individual is guilty, it's not over, right? Then that is passed on to the Supreme Court, to a court of law. The Senate is not a court; it's not a court of law, right? And to act as a court in impeachment trial, so they're acting as a court. They're not fully a court like the Supreme Court. You might have some lawyers in that group of senators, but they're not all seasoned lawyers, and they don't understand law to the extent that 9 judges would, right? So then it has to be passed on to an actual court of law, Supreme Court, and then a verdict determined guilty, not guilty, right? So get that in mind, right? Impeachment, and if the president or whomever is impeached and then acquitted, found no problem by the Senate, there was no conviction. So nothing really happened. They weren't guilty. So you can't use impeachment. I hear people say that, yeah, well, such and so was impeached, or so and so was impeached 2 times, or whatever, right? If they were found not guilty, then so what, right? Doesn't mean anything. Sometimes it just means that the opposition is trying to get the person arrested or indicted, I guess you could say, right? Just because there's a claim that someone is guilty doesn't mean that the individual is guilty, right? Could be that claim could be filed under false pretenses, and that's happened before, right? I'm always amazed that more isn't done to the individuals who impeach or file a claim, and then that claim is found invalid or grossly invalid, grossly inadequate. There's no way that the president or the judge or whomever was being impeached should have been impeached and brought before the Senate for questioning. So we're going to put it back on those who filed the papers for impeachment in the first place. And then we're going to talk to you. Why did you do that? Why are you clogging up our time with false impeachments? I don't see that happening. Odd, right? Isn't that odd? Why doesn't that happen, right? Put it in reverse. Because if there's immorality or unjust actions somewhere within the system, clogging up the system, then you might want to reverse the system and what do you call it? Backhoe the thing, right? Maybe the problem is not with the person being impeached, but the people impeaching. Because those who file papers of impeachment don't always do it for the most righteous reasons or honest or sincere reasons. Sometimes it's just, well, we don't like that person. Let's impeach him, see if we can kick him out of office through indictments. Anyways, by its character and composition, the Senate was well fitted to initiate, prosecute, and judge impeachment proceedings, acting as a bridle on those exercising executive powers. Chapter 66, the Senate would sit as a jury after the House had passed a motion for impeachment. So there you go, right? So it's up to the House to file papers. So the House does the filing of the papers or passing of a motion for impeachment, right? And then the Senate kind of stands in as the jury, right? Or the attorneys sit as a jury. I guess you would need some questioners in there. So Senate, lawyers, Senate. 2/3 majority in favor of conviction would be required in the Senate. That would provide ample security to innocents, and there would be no danger of persecutions. As proposed in the Constitution, the president would nominate men for government office and appoint them with the advice and consent of the Senate. But the Senate, okay, so there you go. There's another time you've probably seen people coming before the Senate and being asked questions, especially those when the president says, I am putting so-and-so up for Secretary of State or, such and such a position in my cabinet. Then they have to go before the Senate, right? So the president will nominate, or judges, right? I've seen that. That's occurred in recent months where Biden has proposed that a certain person be a judge on, I don't know if the Supreme Court, maybe one of the lesser courts, circuit courts. But anyways, and then they're in there for questioning, right? So nominate government office, appoint them with the advice and consent of the Senate. But the Senate would have no voice in choosing nominees. If it disapproved of a particular nominee, the Senate would reject him and force the president to name another, thus having the power to exercise a veto on major appointments, right? So there you go. And it also depends on who's got the majority of the Senate, right? If is it the Republicans or Democrats, which party has the majority in the Senate? So the decision by the Senate, usually if the majority is in line with or the same party as that of the president, right? Say they're all Democrats, and and the president, or how about this one? They're all the Senate is Democrat dominant, and the president is Republican. So the president sends a Republican candidate or nominee, I should say. And so, what do you think is going to happen? Right? A lot of times, that's politics, As this section is largely expository, detailing the nature and necessity of the powers exercised in the United States, there is no need to comment except perhaps to note this. Publius made much of the distinctive character of the Senate arising from the fact that its members would be chosen by state legislatures. That's a point to keep in mind, and not directly by the people, as was the case with the members of the House of Representatives. 1913, with the adoption of the 17th Amendment to the Constitution, it was stipulated that United States senators in each state were to be elected by the people thereof, right? So it used to be like that, right? So an amendment comes along and says, let's give it the election of the senators outright to the people. People are sovereign, so why not, right? All right, so that's it for now. Let's cut that short. Give you a short one for today. So we'll get to the federal, right? I'm sorry, the executive. They talk about a strong executive, right? A whole bunch of the need for strong executive, strong executive, strong executive. A whole bunch of essays on that issue, which is important because the federal or the executive didn't have a lot of power under the Articles of Convention. I'm sorry, the Articles of Confederation. And, taxes couldn't be levied and collected, and monies collected and revenue generated and commerce done in such a way to benefit all the states and so forth and so on. So this is big time, very important. That's why you only see a few essays on the House and Senate, right? Because it really comes down to this, right? Then you got the judiciary. You got a handful on those. Not as numerous as the number of essays for the executive, right? And then conclusion. So that's it for now. Thanks for coming out. Talk soon. Take care.